This webinar is around decision making. Sandy and I are going to walk you through two teaching examples. One is around a district that had a fire right before COVID hit pretty hard and how they used this process. And the other one is going to be around back to school, your planning and decision making that's coming up rapidly on you as you move back to school. It's a tool. It's a tool that we've used as a company, Trigo Ed, for many, many years. It's been used by all levels of people in education, teachers, principals, superintendents. Even on the operational side of the house, this tool is used a lot in transportation, food service. We had a district where we were helping them decide what the trays would look like for the this is before COVID, what the trays would look like, the shape of the trays in the cafeteria. And that was a decision, so they used it. So it's used basically by everybody in education, all staff. Again, like I said, we're going to talk about how you apply it and use it. A little bit of background about me. I'm the executive director of Trigo Ed. I'm Michael Curran-Hayes, obviously. I am a new in my role to this company. I started in the late fall of last year. I got my feet wet, and then the COVID virus hit and everything's changed as I know it. Prior to that, I was a senior partner for our parent company. The parent company of Trigo Ed is called Kempner Trigo. They've been in business for 60 years. I ran the pharmaceutical practice there. Basically, that is a global consulting company that uses the same tools that we'll talk to you about here in education. They just use these same tools in the private industry. Before that, I was the CEO of the company. And before that, way back when, I actually graduated with an education degree. I taught reading, and it was called at that time ESL, English as a Second Language. I graduated in Arizona, and I taught at Nabadio in South Tucson. So all of my students were minorities. All of them were in a lower economic situation. So I've kind of gone full circle. I've now back in the education space and loving it. One of the interesting things I'm finding about is the problems I saw 30 years ago in education, some of them are still out there. So that's another story. The company's been in business for 25 years, Trigo Ed. We've worked with over 850 school districts in the US and Canada. And it's a pretty robust company. It's growing quite a bit. Sandy is our Director of Communication. Sandy, you want to talk about yourself a little bit?
Love to. I started my career in education when I was about 4 years old, and I had a 2-year-old sister, and I said, I started the teaching right then. Stayed in the middle school for my entire career, 33 years at various leadership positions. So I have seen the value of these tools being used on me. I was always on our negotiating team. I've seen them used in a number of ways in a school district, and the value of just having a tool to help you get through these tough and complex decisions.
Cool. Well, together, Sandy and I are going to work this webinar. I'll do a lot of the talking. Sandy will do a lot of the monitoring and moving things. She's actually going to do some sharing of her screen once we get to it where we use the template. In today's world, with the pandemic happening, decision-making has become huge and really, really challenging. Especially as you start to think about some school districts we're working with are wrestling with ideas of summer school. Not many of them. Most of them have really just stopped doing education until the next calendar year starts. So where most of the districts we're working with right now, their decisions around what are we going to do to open up? What are we doing? What are our alternatives? How do we make a good, solid decision around that? There's a ton of conflicting information. I mean, just from the national level, the CDC put out guidelines 3 weeks ago. They were told they were too complex, so they came back out with light guidelines. And then the CDC just came out with guidelines again last week. I've been working with a district up in the Wisconsin area, and they're getting guidelines from their intermediate unit. So there's a ton of conflicting information and not a lot of time as you start to close in on the beginning of the school year. So how do you manage these decisions? What are some of the factors that you look at and you're wrestling with right now as you try to make these kinds of decisions about going back to school or closing up school, or you continue distance learning. Take a minute in the chat window and send us some ideas. What are the factors? What are the issues that you have? Type them in the chat window, and I can't speak. Sandy will share them with me. Anybody having challenges around stakeholders? Oh, there comes some.
Hey, yeah, how do we social distance with large classes? Unknown policies, stakeholders, need more stakeholder input. Safety, how to serve students safely. Getting some stakeholders to participate in input opportunities.
Yeah, you know, this is our fifth webinar around decision making. We've got 2 more coming up, and those challenges and factors that you're talking about are across the country. I guess one of the big takeaways that we're finding out is everybody's in the same kind of complex situation, tough decisions to make, lots of criteria that you're describing there. So the beauty of what we're going to show you is a process that helps you manage that decision making. Difficulties when you're in high stakes decision making, visibility. I mean, there cannot be, I think, in education, any more visible decision than how you're going to go back to school. I live in central PA, or central Pennsylvania, and there was just a big article yesterday from all the superintendents in the area around all the challenges that you're talking about, all the issues you're talking about. You know, are we going to do a hybrid model? Are we going to do just full distance learning come back out? High visibility, high impact, tons of strong feelings from all the shareholders, stakeholders, polarized positions. I was talking to a district in the Nevada market the other day, the chief of staff there, helping him with this decision-making process. And we spent almost the entire hour I was discussing with him was how does he manage two school board members who are totally polarized and know exactly how the school should open in the fall. They know the alternative. Why are you even making choices? Let me tell you how to do that. Looking for high quality solutions, stakeholders, and the ability to get everybody involved so that the decision that comes out from what you do is transparent and everybody has the opportunity to weigh in onto it. So those are one of the difficulties. Too often decision-making looks like a tug-of-war issue, and what we try to get our districts and what we will talk to you about is a tool that gets you to all march forward towards the same alternative, the same solution. Over the years, and this goes back to not just here at Trigo Ed, 60 years as the company was involved in the business, the parent company, we have studied how effective decision-making is done. What do effective decision makers think when they're doing this? And typically you find things listed on the left-hand side. Clear goals and a purpose. Alignment with school district goals. Your strategic plan, does it align with that? Data. If a decision is made with relevant data, that's a better decision. A range of options, not just the school board member saying, hey, we're going to do a hybrid model. This is what we're going to do. What's that range? Maybe the hybrid model fits in it and is the best choice, but what's the range? Once you make your decision, how do you manage the risks? Because there's not a decision made anywhere that doesn't have risks associated with it once you start to implement it. You want to get the support of your key stakeholders. This process is very involving. We try to get tons of people involved, the right people involved, so that they have a position and a place to say things at a table. Coming out of it, there's implementation and communication. And what we found is if you use a process and you use a model, the solutions, the alternative you choose is typically lasting, enduring. On the right-hand side are some of the things we found with ineffective choices. They're sub-optimized. There's resistance because not everybody was involved in the decision-making or at least had a way to put their say in there. Certain criteria were not met because nobody knew about them. Unintended consequences, you didn't think about risk. You know, what happens if we go to a hybrid model, or what happens if we stay in the all distance learning thing? What's the risk associated with that now that we've been doing that for the balance of the last 3 months? Angry people, angry community. We try really hard to keep you from being on the right side and more effectively making your decisions on the left side. It's built around what we call critical thinking. Again, back to the parent company, Kempner Trigo, founded 60 years ago. Ben Trigo is the founder of Trigo Ed, but he was also the founder with his partner, Chuck Kempner, of Kempner Trigo. And basically, Ben and Chuck were social scientists at Princeton University, which is where our corporate headquarters is. And they were hired by the RAND Corporation 60 years ago. And the RAND Corporation was hired by the military to figure out, how do good people make decisions? How do people deal with problems? How do people deal with risk? How do people just deal with the day-to-day situations and issues, which is the top bar across the top? And why do some people do those 4 thinking processes really well and other people don't do it so well? What are they thinking in their head? So for 60 years, Kempner Trigo has been studying how good thinkers think in these 4 areas: top bar, situations, how do you manage complex situations, left bucket, problem analysis, middle one, which I'm going to talk to you today, is around decision making, and the right one is around risk management. How do people think? Data changes, knowledge changes, but still today, people have the same thinking process. So that's what this tool is built around. In the education world, when you work with Trigo Ed, you'll see the same thinking skills, but they look like this. Whoops. So you end up with situation appraisal, which is understanding complex issues. That was our April webinar. It was around, okay, you're coming into or out of the start of blended learning. What are all the challenges and what are all the issues? You will go over to the left one, problem analysis. The middle one, today we're going to talk about select decision analysis. And again, educationally aligned risk management tool called potential problem analysis. All right, jump into this decision analysis. It is a systematic process for making a choice. Why do you care about it? Well, what it does is it balances the benefits with the risks to help you identify the best balanced choice. Out of a number of alternatives, there's a lot of information which alternative meets our criteria the best, and we can minimize the risk to be able to implement it. Typically, when we work with people in decision making, what the pitfall that we see is called jumping to an alternative. Back to my district in Nevada, school board members telling the chief of staff, hey, this is the alternative you should be moving forward with. Right, wrong, or indifferent, this is what you should be doing. That's called jumping to the alternative. When we get involved with people, or when you can use a process, you can say, hey, great, let me take that alternative you feel so passionately about, let me put it in a process, and let's see if the information, the criteria we have, and the data we have supports that as the best alternative. All right, clarifying the purpose. Actually, decision analysis has those steps called select. First, we're going to state the decision. Then we're going to establish the criteria. Then we get into the second half of the process, which is listing the alternatives, evaluating the alternatives against the criteria. Once we choose choose an alternative, we're going to do a risk assessment, and then we're going to implement it, trusting our work and moving forward. So that's the process we're going to walk you through today. Sandy, I see more questions coming up in the chat. Is there anything that I need to answer?
Just some additional comments about things that are difficult about decision making. And one was the considering social emotional learning, and someone else brought up the challenges with engagement and with remote learning. And Sheila just said she loves this way of slowing down to go fast. Too many of us rush to a decision without a process.
No, you're going to love this because we're very much a process-oriented company. Slow down to speed up is a good one. All right. So we start with S, state the decision. It is very simple, very, not a big dissertation, not a chapter in the book. It's just a decision statement. So as an example, 2 of our kids just bought cars. So the decision statement for them, because they're very familiar with this process, they grew up in our household, is select a car or buy a car. It's that simple. It's a choice word, end result, and 1 or 2 key modifiers. So the first example I'm going to walk you through is the one that I talked to you about, a school district down in Virginia that had a major fire in its main electric distribution panel. That panel served both the middle and high school. Fortunately, nobody was hurt in the fire. I think it happened after hours. Obviously, all the right things happened. The fire department got there, they put it out. But at the end of the day, so to speak, there was no way they could continue school in either the middle school or the high school. So it became pretty clear to them that they needed to rationally and critically do some thinking around what are their alternatives and how do we make our best choice. They actually are clients of ours, so they use this decision analysis process. So they start off with their decision statement. Next step, which is a bit of heavy lifting, is what we call the E step, which is establishing and classifying criteria. It's made up of a couple sub-steps. It helps you identify which of your alternatives will be the final choice. The criteria are going to tell you that. Basically, the way you do it is brainstorm. You get your decision statement saying what's the best way to resume school, like our example with the school in Virginia. And you're going to brainstorm criteria, and they're going to be focused around the 3 R's: results, resources, and restrictions. So taking that example, these are some of the criteria that the team we worked with and facilitated virtually came up with. Now remember, I'm just teaching something here, so I have one PowerPoint slide of criteria. In the case of this client, when we were working with them, they had anywhere, I think it was about 8 different slides filled up with lines of criteria. Basically, when we were facilitating the group, we just said, okay, what do you want out of this decision? What are the things that are really important to you? What kind of results do you need? What kind of resources are you going to utilize? What kind of requirements do you have that you have to meet? So an example, they had a requirement that they needed that much space. It's got to be a minimum of 130,000 square feet. The result was they wanted to maximize safety and security. Very important in today's school world. Feasibility around transportation. What are the requirements we have? We have special ed students, we have band, we have athletics, we have just the day-to-day transportation of kids to and from school. How does that impact it? So again, it's a brainstorming step here. We have criteria, you list them out with discussion. In the example, there were many, many more slides, but this is just to teach you and get you a feel and a flavor of it. Let me stop for a second and ask, are there any questions around the first 2 steps? Teaching it's pretty easy and pretty fast, but you get a lot of information coming at you when you do it live, when you're brainstorming. S is get the decision statement. E is establish the criteria. Any kind of questions, any kind of thoughts?
I would like to emphasize that if we stop the webinar right now, you probably have the 2 most important steps that you need to improve any decision that you make. Because right now, if you've stated the decision, that is where you determine the focus. So it's when he gave the car example, it's the difference between I want to buy a car or I want to buy a Ford. Whatever your focus is, whatever your descriptors are, that's the key statement that keeps your group focused. As you know, when you get in a room with a lot of different stakeholders, there's a lot of rabbit holes that you can go into. You have the decision statement up and clear, that's something you can point to. And then the second step where you establish the criteria, that's often people just jump straight to their alternatives. All right, well, here are the 4 things that we can choose from. And I know right now there are 100 blogs in education about the 4 choices that you have. Here you get to say what is best for your district. That's what makes this tool unique, is it allows for the difference in the kids, the community, the financial status, everything about your district, because you're setting the criteria. You're saying, here's what our budget is. You're saying, here's what our town rules are. Here's what the parents think is important. Sheila has asked any rules for brainstorming. I remember Dove, defer judgment on ideas, offbeat ideas, welcome, variety of ideas, expand on previous ideas. Is that considered corny nowadays? I would say when you're using our situation appraisal, absolutely not. That is true brainstorming. You just get at everybody's issues. Here, when we're talking about decision making and we're setting criteria, we want to focus on what is important. So we're going to ask the question, what is the best solution going to look like? So you are going to have some parameters around this to keep it focused on what is the best way that we can focus with these children on this problem.
So let me add a couple things to that one, Sandy. Those are great. And Dove, I'm ambivalent as a person who's done tons of these decisions on how you brainstorm. So if Dove is a technique that works for you and everybody in the room that you're working with understands and you took a minute to explain Dove, really what we're trying to achieve here is to get all the criteria that are possible and important to people out on the table. There's other techniques called nominal group technique where you get everybody to list their ideas down. And then as Cheryl says something and then Sandy says something, I'm crossing them off my list. And then, if I'm not saying much, they'll go to Michael, what's on your list? What's left on your list? It's immaterial to us in this step in the process around how you get the ideas there. So whatever technique you use in brainstorming is absolutely okay with us. We're not wedded to anything. The one thing I will say about listing the criteria is I always go back after we get to what I call the void. I keep asking what else, what else, what else? And when you ask what else and you just get the silence, the crickets, I go back to the criteria and I start usually at the top and I say, okay, here we have must meet CDC guidelines. Who gave that to me and what did you mean by that? Because sometimes when you audit the criteria, I may look at CDC guidelines differently as a criteria than you did, and there may be more than one criteria buried in there. So it's one of the tips that I try to give people is brainstorm them all down, then go back and identify the ones that are kind of fuzzy or vague and ask the person to explain that so at a minimum, everybody at the table having this discussion understands what they meant. So we've listed our criteria. Now we're going to take that list of criteria and we're going to break them down into what we call musts and wants. The musts are really important because at the end of the day, the must criteria are going to actually immediately eliminate some alternatives. If that alternative didn't meet that must, it's out of our decision-making process. So they're pretty robust and important things. Musts are typically mandatory, measurable, and realistic. Once you've identified all your musts in your criteria, everything else is what we call a want. So with the back to the fire, in this particular facilitation with this school district in Virginia, and again, recognize I'm just teaching one exam, one PowerPoint slide. You may have more PowerPoint slides with musts, but their two musts were the space and the state regulatory requirements for education. If the alternatives they looked at did not meet one or both of those, they were not going to go through the rest of the process. They were immediately removed. So that's what a must is. Next step is you're going to identify the remaining criteria that are not musts as wants. And you're going to ask, of the remaining wants, which one or which ones, because you can have more than one 10, just like you can have more than one must, you can have more than one really important want. Which of these remaining criteria are the 10s? Once you've identified those, you take the last criteria that are left with no score and you take them one at a time and you compare them to your 10 or your 10s and you say, in comparison to that 10, how does this score? And it can be a 9 to a 1. So here's what it looks like in the team. The first thing they did after they got their musts was identify their 10s. In this example, the most important wants to them, which are the remaining criteria that are not musts, were safety and security and flexibility of the infrastructure. Those were the 10s. They're the most important wants. Then the next step would be take that allows for feasibility of transportation and say, in comparison to safety, security, and infrastructure, how does that score? Is it a 9? Is it a 1? Is it a 5? Is it a 7? Is it an 8? You will have a lot of discussion around this because you're going to have sometimes camps. No, that's really important. It's a 9. And you're going to have another group and say, I could care less about that. It's a 1. That's what's the beauty of this process because now you're getting input. You're getting people to talk about what's really important to them. But ultimately, you're going to have to score it out. And with this group, this is how they scored that. So that feasibility of transportation in comparison to their two 10s was a 9. Their staff and students' arrival and dismissal times in comparison to the 10s was a 3. So that's how that part of the process works. All right, that's taking your L piece, listing the alternatives and scoring them out, getting the musts, then getting the remaining wants and giving one or more a 10, which is the most important, and then taking the wants that haven't been scored yet and relatively comparing them to the 10s, scoring them out. Anybody have any questions on that step in the process? And
Yes. We've been asked, are the musts the same as the criteria or parameters? So, that is an excellent question, because
yeah, it really is.
The musts are sort of like who gets to play in the game. The musts aren't the things that are most important, but those are the things that are measured, and if they are a must, they eliminate alternatives. For example, if one of your musts was that you had to have 130,000 feet of space for those kids, and one of your alternatives only had 600, that would have to be eliminated.
Yeah, I'll give you another example. Go back to the car one. Again, literally 2 of our kids bought cars. God knows how it happened simultaneously, but last week, and they used this process. One was at the level Sandy was at, buy a car. So there was a large number of alternatives. It could be domestic, could be foreign, could be trucks. The other one was sort of more focused down, select a Toyota. So with the select a Toyota person, one of his musts was, and he lives in Colorado, it's got to be all-wheel drive. So any Toyota, because all-wheel drive was a must, no matter what the make or model or style or feature in any of these other Toyotas, if it didn't have all-wheel drive, it's gone. They're not even going to look at that. So that's the power of what a must does for you. When you look at the district here, and I'll talk a little bit about this in detail, their 2 musts, they had 4 alternatives listed across the top. We could take a look at them. A split day alternative, alternating days, alternating weeks, or a different site altogether. So, we'll go, there was a Kmart, I think it was, Sandy, right?
Yep.
There's a Kmart literally, I think it was across the parking lot from the high school, middle school area. It was vacant. There was a lot of clamor in the district by the public and some of the school board members saying, no, we don't need to do a process. Let's just go get the Kmart going. Well, when they went and looked at it, if you look at the data, it did not have 130,000 square feet. So because that was a must and it was measurable, they eliminated it right away. So then you go to alternating weeks. Again, another requirement. With the alternating weeks, it did not meet that must in the state regs, so it got eliminated right away. And in this example, they're left with 2 alternatives after the musts have done their job in our process. So whoever asked about the must question, hopefully that gives you a sense of how important they are in our process and the power of what they do.
And I just want to point out, as we're looking at this page, that you can see where those 2 musts eliminated them, that we wrote in why they were eliminated. Does not meet that, not available, no available site big enough. Because we wrote in that information, when we go back later and are presenting these options and how we made this decision, we have the reasoning right there in the boxes. So the more data you put in these boxes, the better communication you're going to have of the ultimate decision that you make.
Agreed, Sandy. Good points. Now I'm going to jump back a slide because I slid through it based on the must question. I thought seeing it visually what it did would help you. But I'm going to jump back to this slide because now what we're doing is we're evaluating our options. We're taking these steps and we're walking through them in the rest of the process to determine which is our best balanced choice. Unfortunately, in a 1-hour webinar, we're not going to have a lot of time to teach these separate steps. As Sandy said, S and E, if you can just get through those, you've done a ton of heavy lifting. This is, while not cumbersome, teaching it takes some time. So what I'm going to do is just walk you through that matrix right here and kind of explain what's happening. So as I told you, across the top, you have the alternatives. Our musts have eliminated 2 of them. Sandy's comment was, we put data in these cells. Typically, all these other cells are filled with information, just like you see here and here and here and here. Each cell shows, so in split day, how does it perform against this criteria? Maximizes potential for continued extracurricular participation. That's the data. Harder to facilitate with transportation and evening conflicts. The data for alternating days against that criteria is this one. Same thing up here. So all of these cells will have data in them. They're not blank, but in the case of teaching this, I'm leaving them blank because I need to show you how this works. So then you've eliminated 2 of your alternatives with the musts. Now you're only focusing on your wants. These criteria right here. The musts are done. We don't have to use them again in our process. We're now just focusing on wants. And so basically taking this first want, that's a 10, we look at these 2 alternatives and we say, how do they perform against safety and security? Which one or which ones are the best? And they get a 10. Both are the same. We take the same 2 alternatives. We look at the next criteria. Flexibility of infrastructure and space. Which one performs better than the other? In this case, alternating days was the best performer. He got a 10. In comparison, split days was an 8. Then we do the same thing. Transportation. How does split days score against it? 2. How does alternating score against it? 8. On and on and on. You're making this comparison to the criteria and figuring out which one scores the best and what that score is. Then the math is pretty simple. The 100 comes from 10 times 10. Again, the 100 comes from this score times the alternative score. 10 times 8 is 80, 10 times 10 is 100. Go all the way down. The last step mathematically is add up your 2 columns. So when you do the scoring, you do the math, you add it up, the alternating days clearly was the winner by 102 points, okay? Any questions on the matrix and those quick teaching of those steps? I know it's a lot, but again, if I take time to do this, this would be a 4-hour webinar.
Again, you know, the value here is just to see that establishing the criteria and prioritizing them somehow is going to give you the best possible solution that you have, that you can come up with. When you compare your alternatives that you came up with, the choices you came up with your criteria.
Why is it important to list your criteria before you do and list your alternatives? What's the value of laying out that list of criteria? So what's the value of listing all those things under established criteria? Why do you do that first before you get to alternatives? Anybody have any thoughts on that?
Criteria needs to be objective and not influenced by potential alternatives. That's an excellent point, Vanessa. Criteria listing establishes parameters. Yep, exactly.
Agreed.
2 very good points.
You know, like we talked about a little earlier, that pet alternative pitfall piece, this helps keep that from happening. Back to my school board members in the Nevada area. Clearly they have pet alternatives, and that was my coaching with the chief of staff to say, look, acknowledge their pet alternatives, but say you're going to use a process and we're going to put them into the process to see how well they perform. And if they perform really well, clearly we're going to go that route. But let's get the criteria down first. What do we want out of going back to school? What do we need? What resources? You know, what kind of results? And list those down, and then you can plug those alternatives in as the second step. I see some more chat stuff, Sandy.
Yep, you will know what you need or must have, and criteria is a must. Needs need to be met first.
Agreed.
And Karen said, big ideas. Yes, these are the big ideas. This is, you know, this is your perfect solution. In a perfect world, what would your criteria be? What are you looking for? So great to clarify that before you start looking at your choices.
The last, when I was in my other career as a senior partner in the parent company, the last major decision analysis I worked on was for a large government. And this government's decision statement was, how do we store our radioactive nuclear waste? So for a government, that's a pretty important decision because they were going to bury it in the ground somewhere in this country. So they basically created an NGO, non-governmental organization, to manage that decision. And it's been a decision they've been working on for 5 years because it needs a lot of refinement. They have a lot of data they have to get. But one of the cool things about working with this prime minister and his cabinet was that they wanted to be inclusive. They wanted to bring states in. They wanted to bring in constituents, and they wanted to make sure stakeholders had a say in this process. And they started to do that immediately. Certain states or certain areas of this country said, no, we don't want it, obviously, not in our backyard. Others were fully embracing it. So the only way they could manage how to do this was get the criteria first, then let's start looking at alternatives. And it's paid off dividends. It's really made this what could be a really contentious process that's taken, like I said, we're on the 5th year, walking our way through it, getting the political apparatus, local apparatus, the local people to support what looks like going to be a really robust decision. And the only way it worked effectively was getting that criteria up first. All right, let me jump. So we have covered everything in our process except for the risk assessment. And the risk assessment, we always recommend you do at the end. And the idea here is we have 2 alternatives we're looking at. One clearly scored very well, was 482, the alternative days. So the concept in risk assessment is to say with alternative days, what could go wrong? If we implement alternative days as our solution in the current building we have, or the extra building we have in the school district, what is the risk? What could go wrong? And so you can see 2 risks there. Changing schedule on Saturdays made it challenging for students who have jobs, and childcare, athletic competitions. On split day, they also did a risk assessment for it. And what you do in the risk assessment is you just list and say, okay, what could go wrong if we choose split day? Now, again, I'm doing a teaching example. There were many more risks with each alternative, but in the example for split day, there are 2. 2 populations sharing a school building, that's challenging. Timing for athletic practices and competitions on a split day, how does that work? Then once you do your risk assessment, you step back and look at it and say, alternative days clearly scored 482 points out of the 2 alternatives we have left. It gave us the best balance based on our criteria, but is it too risky? And if you look at alternative days and you're willing to accept those risks, then that's going to be your choice. But if you look at it and you say, wow, there's just too much risk associated with that, you're going to go to your second highest scoring one, which in this case was split day. Take a look at those risks, see if you're comfortable with them, and if you are, you're going to make your choice and move forward. So that's the last step in the process. It's select. The last one is the risk assessment piece, which helps you trust your decision.
It's important to know that there might be a choice that ends up with a higher numerical score, but because the risks are so high, for example, the risk that if they went to the every other day schedule, they were going to have school on Saturdays, and all of the things that could affect, it might make the decision different than the numerical score. So the risks can actually tilt the balance. It's a balancing scale.
Yep, good point, great point. All right, so now we're going to step into your back to school plan and take the same process and walk you through it and get you involved in doing it a little bit. So decision statement, again, the first step in select is ask, state the decision. We want a choice word, end result, and a couple modifiers. Real simple, select the best plan for going back to school. Every one of you on this webinar is facing that decision. Either you're a part of it, you're involved in it, you're helping make it, or you're going to be impacted by it. So this is a really relevant example. That's the S, select the best plan for back to school. Next step is the E step, establishing and classifying criteria. So the first thing you do in the criteria thing is you're going to brainstorm them down. What are the criteria for going back to school? What are the things we need to look at? What results, what resources, what restrictions do we have in place? To get you started, here are two, and we do the same teaching example since we've been doing the DEA webinar, select webinar, and the same thing we're doing when we're facilitating school districts. These always bubble to the top. These are typically the first two. It's got to meet CDC guidelines and it has to meet state requirements. Those are two criteria. Now, Sandy, I'm going to turn it over to you. And what I want everybody else on the webinar to do is to give Sandy what these criteria that are empty would look like. So you're going to, in the chat, I'm going to stop sharing. Oh, Sandy, I forgot you're the host. You can do this. Oh, I got a question before you do that. How do you move forth if all don't agree? It's a great question. The simple and quick answer is, if everybody was involved, or at least people representing you were involved in this decision-making process, you have a much greater likelihood of moving forward, even if you have some people who don't agree. I would never tell you that this process is foolproof or 100%, positive. You're never going to have people as naysayers or complainers. But one of the beauties I found in using this process for the last 25 years is if you really think up front who should be involved in it and get the right representation at the table and the right shareholders at the table, you still have some possibility that not everybody's going to agree with the alternative, but you have a process, you have data, you have information that you can use to tell them why their alternative or their thinking wasn't the way the district was going to go. Sandy, anything to add to that one?
It's all about building consensus. You just have to, you have to find something that, a number that people can live with. So if some people are saying, well, it has to be an 8, and some people are saying it has to be a 5, you say, well, can we live with making this a 7? And, just trying to build consensus as you go.
Okay, thanks for the question. Obviously, we offline can go into it in a deeper detail because that is a bit of a challenge coming out of any kind of decision-making process, but hopefully that gives you some insights. So right now, in the chat, I want you to chat out what are the criteria you're talking about now in your districts about going back to school. Most people are looking at it in the fall. Sandy, I don't think there's any districts that we're supporting right now or have been working with or even just talking to that aren't looking at moving back in the fall.
Well, they're looking at some way to restart school after summer. So what that looks like, what we want to know is exactly, as Mary already put in there, is it going to be virtual, face-to-face, or blended? So what would be, here when we write it in as our criteria, what is it that we want? Do we want it to be blended? What is your best case scenario in this?
Marilyn, Sheila says required days and hours of instruction for all students. So we need to have that.
Yes.
All right. What else from somebody? What are other criteria you're looking at? That's it. 4?
You know what? I think we have safety here.
Yep, safety and security.
Security, which are always top things.
All right. Kim is saying safety again, which we've already captured once. School remote blended.
Transportation, absolutely.
Yep. Transportation. Sheila's saying meals.
Yep. How are we going to feed them? What's the cafeteria going to be like? All of those. We've run out of space on this page, so I'm going to stop you here, but they're, just around eating, there could be a whole decision-making matrix.
Right. Aaron threw in another one. So in the real world, again, we're just teaching right now, so we're stopping because we ran out of space. But in the real world, I take Karen saying equity with technology.
Yes.
Add another row in there below meals and type that one in. Moore has said parents at home. I typed that criteria in. you would keep brainstorming all the criteria that are possible based on what your back to school might look like until you hit what's called the void. When you keep asking, what else, what else, what other resources, what results, what kind of regulations do we have to deal with? And people just stop giving you information. That's when you'd stop adding lines in there. So don't get fooled by the template, because we're going to share this with you. It's not limiting you to just those number of rows. It's keep adding it until you get done and you don't have anything else from anybody else. That's what establishing the criteria is about. All right, Sandy, you want to stop sharing and we'll jump back into teaching a little bit and review? All right. All right, so those are the criteria. Here's what, again, teaching for you. We're just giving you an example. I know you gave us a bunch of criteria. I'm just trying to quickly teach it again. 4 criteria listed here. Meets state requirements is a must. Meets CDC guidelines is a must for us in our example. Maximizes safety and maximizes state requirements for all students. Then when you go over to the left, you've identified your musts out of the 4. The next step is to identify the most important want. It is safety, would be a 10. And then the next step in our process would be taking the remaining criteria and saying, how does that compare to a 10? Is it a 9 or is it a 1? Now again, there's a whole host of criteria here that we'd be doing these steps with. Don't get lulled into there's only 4. That's just the teaching example. There's a bunch there. That's that step in the process. Then when you put it into the matrix, it begins to build out and look like this. In many cases, these are the actual plans we're hearing around the country. There are other alternatives, but we're hearing a lot about cohorts. Hybrid plan, which is a 50-50, 50% of the time is distance learning, 50% of the time is at the brick and mortar. We're still having school districts that we're working with as part of an alternative. It's going to be a normal start in the fall. How does that score? And then we have a district I actually talked to this morning that was still looking at, yes, we're doing okay in distance learning. We stay 100% going into the fall. So again, alternatives are laid across the top in this matrix. You have the 4 criteria I showed you and how you got there. You would have other criteria listed here with scores that are a relative comparison to this 10. And then the data that you have in these cells tells you how each alternative scores against the criteria. In this hypothetical example, Plan C, 100% distance learning, did not meet the state requirements. So it's gone. That's what the must did to it. Then we've got 3 left. And in this particular case, meets CDC guidelines, normal start, wouldn't do it in this particular case for this district. So that alternative is gone. They're left with 2. And what you would have happen is those 2 would have data in these cells. You would get the scoring for each alternative against the criteria. You'd add up your rows and you'd come up with one of the 2 alternatives scored better than the other one. Then the last step in the process is that risk assessment. Typically, in the real world, we normally have more than 4 alternatives. We usually have, I've had it where, well, back to the government one with the NGO, we've got about 20 alternatives. We typically take the top 2 scoring alternatives when you have lots and lots of alternatives, and you do the risk assessment. If we decide to stay with cohorts and Plan A, what are the risks associated with that? If we go with the hybrid plan, what are the risks associated with that? The risk assessment helps you feel comfortable in making your best balanced choice. It could be that your hybrid model scored the best, but there's so much involved around risk and risk management with it that you decided to go to the second highest scoring one in cohorts, and you make that your choice. All right, I believe, Sandy, that is it. We're running out of time. Couple quick things. Good decision making requires these bullets. We've talked about most of them. This process uses all of those. How can you use this when you go back to school? Remember, biggest thing about this process is it can be used for any decision at school. Back to my early example, I worked with somebody before the pandemic happened, and they used it to decide which cafeteria trays to use. I worked with another district recently around what kind of transportation are they going to do? Are they going to buy buses with natural gas, gasoline, electric? So it can be used anywhere. What kind of software do you want to buy? It can be used for that. It's big right now around back to school and your planning and what alternative works. I saw the chat box pop up. Maybe somebody had to leave, but are there questions before I jump into closing?
Well, I just wanted to tell everyone that they would get a PDF of this presentation and a follow-up email. And Sheila said, this is so meaningful. I can apply it everywhere. Yep, thanks for sharing. And Michael's going to tell you that we are more than happy to support you if you decide to embark on using these processes. So.
Yeah, so this webinar covered decision making. This is our roadmap to back to school. It's a real high level process that we're talking to the districts about. There are a lot of roadmaps out there. This one is around decision making. The previous webinars in April around the very first steps, which are what are all the issues and challenges and opportunities you have going back to school. It's a scan webinar. You can find it. It's downloaded on our website. So please take some time if you missed the first round of webinars. We have 2 more coming up, one around special education. What are all the inherent challenges and opportunities with special education as things are happening now with distance learning? We have a special education practice, and this will be led by our practice leader. And the last webinar, we're talking about potential problem analysis. By the time we get to this, which will probably be July, people will have their plans in place. We'll talk about that last model we showed you around potential problem analysis. How do you manage the risks with whatever alternative you chose? Just what Sandy said, we'll send you a PowerPoint presentation, worksheet template. This is our contact information. Please reach out to us. We are more than happy to help you use this tool or any of our other tools as you go through this really unusual time period. We offer free consulting right now. We're offering free coaching. So if you get the template and you have questions about it and you want to call me or email me, we're doing a free virtual workshop for a particular district that wanted to do some stuff around SCAN. So there's a ton of ways we can support you. So let us know. That's it, Sandy. You have anything to say?
No, I thank all of you for participating and being engaged in this. It always makes it so much more valuable for all of the participants. So just thank you for your participation. I hope you have a great rest of the day. I hope the sun comes out wherever you are.
Absolutely. Enjoy yourselves. Stay safe and stay healthy. Take care.